In the winter of 1847, after a speech delivered behind locked church doors in New England, Douglass was meant to board a train. He never arrived. The congregation waited. The station emptied. Snow erased the footprints. No record explains what happened in the hours that followed. Official biographies skip this night entirely. What remains is silence, deliberate, polished, institutional silence. This story is not about the Frederick Douglass you were taught to admire from a distance. This is about the man who frightened the architecture of power so deeply that entire systems bent to contain him. A man whose intellect was not merely persuasive, but destabilizing. A man who saw something beneath the language of freedom that others were not ready to confront. In letters never published, Douglass wrote of a second bondage, cleaner, quieter, and far more enduring. He described churches that trained obedience, schools that taught forgetting, and laws that pretended to liberate while perfecting control. After that winter night, his tone changed. Witnesses later recalled that when Douglass returned, weeks later, thinner, quieter, he no longer spoke freely of certain truths. Entire passages vanished from his lectures. Metaphors hardened into warnings. And sometimes, mid-sentence, he would stop speaking altogether, as if listening to someone else in the room. This documentary follows what he nearly revealed. Not the chains on the body, but the architecture built to survive their removal. What you are about to hear was never meant for public memory. It was buried in church minutes, orphan registries, altered sermons, and marginal notes written by hands that shook as they wrote them. This is not the story of a man who escaped slavery. This is the story of what followed him when he did. Frederick Douglass was not supposed to learn how to read. That much is well known. What is less known, almost never discussed, is how quickly he learned once the barrier cracked. Those who encountered him in his early years described something unsettling, not intelligence alone, but velocity. He absorbed language the way fire consumes dry wood, without pause, without permission. Plantation overseers noticed it first. They reported that Douglass did not merely read words. He dismantled them. He asked why laws contradicted sermons, why scripture required submission from some and authority from others, why literacy was called dangerous only when held by the enslaved. By the time Douglass escaped, several families in Maryland quietly removed books from their homes. Ministers altered lessons. Children were warned not to repeat certain questions, because Douglass had discovered something older than slavery itself. In a forgotten ledger from a Baltimore church, a margin note reads, "The Boise structure where we teach story." When Douglass began writing, abolitionists celebrated his voice, but editors feared his precision. His early manuscripts, now lost, reportedly mapped moral authority the way an engineer maps bridges. Power, obedience, fear, inheritance. One editor later confessed that entire chapters were removed, not for violence, but for clarity. He named things too accurately. Douglass understood that slavery was not an aberration. It was a prototype, a training system, a rehearsal for something that could survive its own abolition by relocating into schools, pulpits, and paperwork. This insight made him invaluable. It also made him dangerous. When he spoke, people felt exposed, not accused, seen. And institutions do not forgive mirrors. The churches welcomed Frederick Douglass, publicly. Privately, they cataloged him. In the 1840s, a network of seminaries across the Northeast shared handwritten evaluations of visiting speakers. These documents were not sermons or reviews. They were risk assessments. Next to Douglass's name, one phrase appears repeatedly: excessive influence. Church elders worried not about rebellion, but reinterpretation. Douglass did not reject Christianity. He anatomized it. He distinguished between faith and its administration, between Christ and the institutions that claimed him. During one closed-door address, Douglass reportedly asked a question that ended the meeting early. If salvation requires submission, who decides what obedience looks like? No transcript of that speech survives. What does survive are the reactions. Churches began insisting that Douglass speak only from approved texts. Invitations came with conditions. Doors were locked. Hymns were extended to prevent questions. In one Massachusetts town, an orphanage attached to a church removed its older children from the sanctuary before Douglass arrived. The reason, according to the matron's diary, he teaches them to hear what we cannot unsay. After his mysterious disappearance in 1847, Several of these churches revised their records. Dates shifted, minutes were rewritten, attendance lists shortened, and Douglass, once welcomed everywhere, found certain doors permanently closed. Not because he spoke against God, but because he exposed who was speaking for him. When Frederick Douglass vanished that winter night, no newspaper ran a headline. That alone should trouble you. A man of his stature, internationally known, politically volatile, disappeared without alarm. No search parties, no editorials. Only a brief notice, days later, stating that a scheduling complication had delayed his travel. Behind the scenes, something else occurred. Rail logs were altered, boarding records amended. A station master in Vermont resigned without explanation, and a small religious council convened, not to pray, but to decide what would be remembered. When Douglass reemerged, he carried himself differently. He still spoke of freedom, but now as something fragile, conditional, almost temporary. He warned that systems learn, that oppression adapts, that victory can be absorbed and repurposed. Those closest to him noticed the cost. He slept poorly. He burned drafts. He stopped naming certain institutions entirely. And once, only once, he told a fellow abolitionist, "They showed me how memory is managed. What they showed him has never been written plainly, but traces remain." In the sections ahead, we will follow those traces, through orphan records that don't align, sermons that repeat phrases Douglass never published, and towns that prospered by forgetting exactly what he tried to teach them. This is where the descent begins. The first real fracture in the official record appears far from Frederick Douglass himself. It appears in the orphanages. Between 1848 and 1861, church-run orphan homes across New England reported an unusual pattern. Children arriving with no surnames, no baptism records, and no confirmed parentage, yet all of them could read fluently. Some could write with unsettling precision. The children shared something else. They asked questions adults could not answer without becoming angry. Why were rules different depending on who enforced them? Why did sermons change meaning depending on who listened? Why did freedom always come with paperwork? In one orphanage ledger, a caretaker scribbled a warning. They sound like him. Like Frederick Douglass. The children were not taught his writings. In fact, his books were restricted in these institutions. And yet, phrases appeared in their essays, phrases Douglass had spoken only once, in private lectures now missing from archives. Administrators responded quickly. Reading hours were reduced. Writing assignments shortened. Curiosity was reframed as disrespect. Several children were quietly relocated, sent west, sent south, sent somewhere the records stopped following them. One supervisor wrote bluntly, "The mind must not outpace its station." This was not discipline. It was containment. And it revealed something chilling. Douglass's influence had moved beyond speeches. His ideas had escaped his authorship. They had become contagious, replicating wherever young minds encountered contradiction. Institutions do not fear rebellion as much as they fear inheritance. Because rebellion can be crushed. Inheritance cannot. Frederick Douglass gave hundreds of lectures. Only a fraction survived intact. Between 1847 and 1855, at least 11 recorded lectures were announced, attended, and then erased. No transcripts. No summaries. Only scattered reactions, letters, diary entries, marginalia scribbled by those who heard something they were not meant to repeat. One attendee wrote, "He did not argue. He diagnosed." These lectures did not focus on slavery as an institution, but as a template, a method refined through repetition, a system capable of shedding its most visible cruelty while preserving its function. According to a surviving note, Douglass once said, "When chains are removed, instruction replaces them. When whips disappear, rules remain." Editors refused to print this, not because it was false, but because it implicated everyone. A publishing partner later admitted that the lectures made benefactors uncomfortable. They suggested that abolition alone would not dismantle control, only relocate it into law, education, and moral authority. This was not the story the nation wanted. So the lectures vanished. In their place, a safer Douglass was curated. Inspirational, historical, contained. His sharpest insights were trimmed into quotes that could be admired without being followed. What remained was a silhouette. And silhouettes do not threaten structures. There are towns in America that grew rapidly after Douglass passed through. New schools, new churches, new civic halls, all preaching progress, all built on silence. In at least 3 towns, property records show sudden donations following his visits, money redirected from abolitionist funds into educational reform. Yet no curriculum changes followed. No new books, no expanded access, only oversight. Boards formed, committees multiplied, moral instruction intensified. Freedom was reframed as responsibility, responsibility as obedience. In one town, a memorial plaque mentions Douglass, but only as a visitor. Nothing of what he said, nothing of why the meeting ended early, nothing of why attendance logs were later revised. A local historian once whispered, "He scared the donors." Not with anger, with clarity. These towns learned something crucial, that you do not need to suppress truth completely. You only need to exhaust it. Surround it with procedure. Delay it. File it. Drown it in respectability. And so they prospered. Clean streets. Quiet churches. Children taught not to ask certain questions, because those questions had already been answered once, and the answers were inconvenient. By the 1860s, Frederick Douglass was celebrated, but he was also constrained. His later speeches carry a weight that earlier ones did not, a restraint that feels less like wisdom and more like calculation. He chose words carefully, paused often, let silence speak where language once cut. Those closest to him noticed a grief that had no clear source. He had seen behind the curtain and understood that exposure alone does not dismantle systems. Sometimes it teaches them to evolve. In a private letter, Douglass wrote, "I fear we have mistaken the cage for the bird." That sentence was never published during his lifetime. It suggests something terrifying, that freedom movements can be absorbed, neutralized, and repurposed to stabilize the very structures they oppose. Douglass continued to speak, but the fire was focused now, directed toward survival, not revelation. He had learned what happens when truth arrives too early. In the next section, we will follow the afterimage of his suppressed ideas, how they resurfaced decades later in unexpected places, carrying echoes of a warning America still refuses to hear. Ideas do not disappear. They wait. Decades after Frederick Douglass stopped speaking openly about certain truths, fragments of his suppressed language began resurfacing in places that should not have known his voice. In the early 1890s, educators in the Midwest reported a phenomenon they could not explain. Students, many from church-run schools, began using identical metaphors in essays about freedom, discipline, and morality. They spoke of invisible fences, of obedience mistaken for virtue, of chains that leave no marks. These phrases did not exist in published texts, but they did exist in Douglass's vanished lectures. Administrators assumed plagiarism. Investigations followed. Books were inspected. Nothing was found. The language had no single source, only repetition. A superintendent finally wrote, "It is as if the thought survived the man." That frightened them. Because institutions can monitor people, they can blacklist speakers, revise records, and curate memory. But ideas that migrate without attribution, ideas carried through conversation, through questions, through the instinctive recognition of injustice, cannot be traced or contained. This was Douglass's final, unintentional legacy, not a doctrine, a disturbance. Around the same time, several theological seminaries quietly revised their coursework. Sin was redefined. Obedience was emphasized. Doubt was reframed as pride. Students were taught that questioning authority, even moral authority, was the first step toward chaos. Faith, they were told, required submission not only to God, but to his appointed structures. The timing was not accidental. Archived faculty correspondence reveals anxiety about ideological drift. One letter explicitly references Douglass, not by name, but by description. The former slave who mistook discernment for revelation. That sentence reveals more than intended. It acknowledges that Douglass did not attack belief. He attacked delegation. The idea that morality could be outsourced to institutions and enforced through tradition rather than conscience. Seminaries responded by reinforcing hierarchy. The message was subtle but firm. Freedom without guidance becomes danger. Authority without questioning becomes safety. Douglass had warned against this, and so they taught his warning in reverse. In church schools and orphan homes, reports continued to surface of children who did not behave improperly, but thought improperly. They asked why punishment often masqueraded as care, why rules were enforced unevenly, Why goodness required silence. Teachers described these children as unsettling. Not disruptive, not defiant, just awake. One orphanage record notes a boy who refused to recite a pledge, not out of rebellion, but confusion. He asked, calmly, why loyalty was demanded before understanding. He was removed within the week. Transferred. Where he went is unknown. Similar cases appear again and again. Children redirected, relocated, absorbed into systems where records thin out and oversight becomes opaque. What united them was not lineage, race, or creed. It was perception. They had inherited the question Douglass once asked aloud. Who decides what obedience looks like? Institutions cannot tolerate that question for long. By the early 20th century, Frederick Douglass had been safely transformed. He was honored, quoted, memorialized, but he was no longer dangerous. Statues replaced questions. Textbooks flattened complexity into inspiration. His sharpest insights were buried beneath celebration. This is how power survives critique. It does not erase dissidents. It preserves them selectively. Douglass became a symbol of triumph rather than a warning about systems that adapt faster than resistance. His legacy was framed as a closed chapter, not an unfinished diagnosis. And yet, the architecture he described still stands. Churches still teach obedience as virtue. Schools still reward silence over curiosity. Bureaucracies still define freedom through forms and permissions. Douglass saw this coming. He tried to name it. What stopped him was not violence, but refinement. The quiet consensus that some truths destabilize too much to be spoken plainly. In the next section, we descend into the final phase of this story. What happens when a nation canonizes a man while carefully ignoring what he actually understood? There is a moment when every dangerous thinker is rendered harmless. It does not happen through censorship. It happens through reverence. By the 1920s, Frederick Douglass had become curriculum. His image appeared in schoolrooms. His words were quoted during ceremonies. His life was framed as a completed journey from bondage to triumph. But something vital was missing. His discomfort. Douglass had not intended to be comforting. He had intended to be precise. He spoke not only of injustice, but of the machinery that manufactures it and survives reform by changing its language. That machinery did not disappear. It simply learned to praise him. By celebrating Douglass as proof of progress, institutions insulated themselves from his critique. His presence became evidence that the system worked, rather than a warning that it evolves. A former educator wrote privately, "They keep his portrait on the wall so no one asks why the room still feels locked." This is the final stage of containment, when a voice is no longer silenced, but absorbed. In several archives, Frederick Douglass's correspondence stops abruptly, not at his death, but years before. Letters trail off. Pages are missing. Entire exchanges are reduced to single surviving sentences, clipped and contextless. Archivists insist this is coincidence. Paper decays. Fires happen. Storage fails. But patterns emerge. The missing documents cluster around one theme: institutional power after emancipation. Churches, schools, civic bodies. The places where authority disguises itself as care. One surviving fragment reads, "They believe cruelty ends when it becomes polite." The rest of the letter is gone. What remains suggests Douglass was attempting to document something systemic, not an event, but a transition. How domination sheds spectacle and adopts administration. This was not a popular line of thought. It implicated reformers, philanthropists, and moral leaders alike. And so the paper trail ends. In 1872, Frederick Douglass was scheduled to deliver a lecture in Philadelphia. The title was announced, "On the Afterlife of Slavery." It never happened. No illness was reported. No conflict noted. The lecture was simply canceled, replaced by a discussion panel on national progress. Douglass did not protest publicly, but a handwritten note in a private collection offers a glimpse. They prefer ghosts they can honor to systems they must dismantle. That sentence alone explains the cancellation. The lecture would have forced the audience to confront continuity, not rupture. To see slavery not as a concluded horror, but as a methodology capable of inhabiting new forms. The room was not ready. Perhaps it still isn't. Near the end of his life, Frederick Douglass spoke less about freedom and more about vigilance. He warned that moral language can be weaponized, that institutions crave legitimacy more than justice, that oppression rarely announces itself, it embeds. Those who listened carefully sensed a quiet urgency in his voice. Not despair. Preparation. Douglass had learned that exposing truth does not guarantee transformation. Sometimes it merely instructs power on how to camouflage itself better. And yet, he continued. Not because he believed he would be fully heard, but because ideas planted imperfectly still grow. There is a lie more effective than denial. It is the lie of closure. By the mid-20th century, America taught itself a comforting story. Slavery had ended, injustice had been corrected, and Frederick Douglass stood as proof that the system, though flawed, could redeem itself. This story produced calm classrooms, calm churches, calm civic spaces where questions were permitted only if they did not disturb the narrative. But Douglass had warned against this kind of peace. Peace that demands forgetfulness. Peace that rewards compliance. Peace that treats discomfort as danger. In one of his final reflections, preserved only through a second-hand account, Douglass allegedly said, "Power does not fear anger. It fears understanding. Understanding requires unease. And unease was precisely what institutions learned to suppress, not through force, but through reassurance. By convincing generations that the work was done, they ensured it would not be revisited. This was the most sophisticated form of control Douglass ever encountered. Not chains, not laws, but certainty. Frederick Douglass believed that truth, once spoken, had momentum. He was right, but he underestimated something else. Truth also teaches its enemies. The systems Douglass exposed did not collapse. They studied him. They learned his language. They adopted his moral vocabulary and drained it of its edge. Freedom became a slogan. Equality became procedural. Justice became conditional. Institutions learned to speak like reform while operating like control. Douglass had once identified slavery as a training ground, not only for obedience, but for administration. What followed emancipation was not the end of that training, but its refinement. Paper replaced chains. Policy replaced whips. Morality replaced force. And most people accepted the exchange because it looked like progress. Douglass saw this pattern early. That is why he frightened them. Every generation is taught a version of Frederick Douglass that feels safe. A man who overcame. A man who triumphed. A man who belongs firmly to the past. But the real danger of Douglass was never his suffering. It was his analysis. He refused to believe that freedom could be granted permanently by any institution. He believed it had to be practiced, questioned, defended, constantly. That belief makes people uneasy. So history softened him. It edited his warnings into inspiration, his diagnosis into celebration, his unfinished questions into decorative quotes. This is not accidental. It is how societies protect themselves from reflection. Remembering him incorrectly was easier than listening to him fully. Frederick Douglass did not disappear that winter night in 1847. Something else did. The nation's willingness to hear what he was truly saying. He tried to explain that oppression does not end, it migrates. That power rarely dies, it adapts. That freedom without vigilance becomes ceremony. He understood that the most enduring prisons are the ones people stop recognizing as cages. This documentary is not an accusation. It is an invitation to reread, to reconsider, to notice the structures we inherit and the questions we are taught not to ask. Douglass once wrote that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. What he never stopped implying is something far more unsettling. That ignorance makes slavery unnecessary. And that may be the secret America was never meant to confront.